We are a nation in mourning, whether we remember it or not. We've gone through a pandemic where we've lost 20 million souls globally and counting, and now thinker after thinker is telling us that our society is falling apart. I submit to you that these are not two distinct questions, but one. The same question and the essential question for our next century of crises. How do these things we call disasters, these things that Tom Drabek famously named non-routine social problems, how do they trigger social change? And how do we, or should we, manage them towards positive social change? Our field doesn't give us great tools on this question, I think. Ever since Samuel Prince, after Halifax, said all catastrophes provoke social change, scholars have been arguing about it. Anthony Oliver Smith says that disasters don't cause social change, they can just speed up change that's already happening. Mark Pelling and Kathleen Dill, though, said that sometimes there are moments where disasters can shift our direction one way or another. Rebecca Solnit picked that up and told a joyful story in A Paradise Built in Hell. Naomi Klein went the other direction and talked about how the change can lead us towards autocracy and the shock doctrine. Which is it? Is it a good story or a bad one? You know, it's funny, but Henry Quarantelli disagreed with Drabek's non-routine social problems definition. It's not as famous, but he said, look, disasters don't come out of nowhere. They're not blank slate events. They should be embedded in our ongoing social change dynamics. They're part of what changes us. And calling them problems, that's elite bias. Disasters create winners and losers, and sometimes after the disaster, they are different than who they were before. So the question before us today, to me, is not do disasters cause social change, or even what kind of social change do disasters cause? It's how do we navigate the management of disasters to figure out who Quarantelli's winners and losers are going to be, and make sure that that structure works to the social good after these events. To do this, we have to go below the level of sociology, below the level of social structures, into the realm of the structures of knowledge itself, epistemology. We have to look and understand how disasters change the ways we understand the world, and in turn, how those changes in understanding change our choices, which then change our social structures. If we can map that, then we're getting somewhere. In our new book, the feminist philosopher Jordan Pascoe and I try to do this. We try to set out a tool set to use to navigate changes in how we understand the world and how those changes prompt changes in social dynamics. Let me tell you how we think that it happens. This is a block of acrylic being injected with 5 million volts of electricity. If you put that much power into something, it will change its structure. I'm an emergency manager. I've responded to 24 federally declared disasters and emergencies. They're all tragic, and in every one of them, the community is injected with this kind of electricity. To the survivors, it's like they've been struck by lightning. Now, a lot of scholars have wrestled with this phenomenon as a static event. To us, it's the beginning of a journey. We call it disaster natality, with a nod to Hannah Arendt. Disaster natality is a change in the way you understand the world that forces you into action, forces you to connect with other people, to heal the injury to your community. It prompts convergence, it prompts milling, and the magic of it is that disaster natality is scalable. One survivor is struck by lightning, they connect with another, and it forms a social immune system, which generates and supports the community responses that we have. After the 1918 pandemic, Laura Spinney writes in her book, Pale Rider, so many countries around the world began to move towards health care for all. Not here, obviously, but she looked at the UK and the founding of their National Health Service, Germany and the founding of their public medical model. Those groups of people came together as societies to address the communal horror that they saw together, and they made their societies better. The anthropologist Christopher Dyer calls this a phoenix effect. When you pair strong resources with an understanding of the underlying social dynamics together, you can create a disaster response that surges you into the future, that lifts all boats in a society. you make a better world. But there's a darker side to this too, an inverse mirror world of it, in which when the disaster response fragments people apart, when it makes them feel isolated and alone, when they have to face this chaos by themselves, this connection between natality, this energy people feel, and the question of human solidarity, it breaks. And that fractures the social immune system that we rely on for community disasters. And in that moment, that energy, the lightning is still there, but it's disconnected to other humans, and that's when things get really bad. 1904, there was an outbreak of plague in Johannesburg. All the city leaders got together and they decided that they were going to put forth the most modern quarantine and isolation facilities ever made in human history. The press cheered them on. And who went into those camps? Black South Africans. The name of the main camp outside of Johannesburg was Klipspruit. Later it was renamed Pimville. Finally it was called Soweto. Those public health interventions led directly to the founding of apartheid in South Africa. Christopher Dyer, the anthropologist, has a term for this too. He calls it punctuated entropy. When you respond to crisis after crisis without an understanding or appreciation of the underlying solidarity dynamics, you will weaken that community bit by bit over time. It becomes corrosive, he says, until finally it ceases to function as a society at all. Disasters are fractal. The energy that natality ejects into a community is just like the lightning in this block of acrylic. It can move you in many various directions through repeating electric patterns. Some of them move us to greater hope and solidarity, and some of them towards backlash, autocracy, and authoritarianism. We have to understand and track how these movements work, how the motions of our changes in understanding change our underlying social dynamics. In our book, we map these changes against the psychological phases of disaster, point by point, to show how the choices we make, the shifts in our understanding, change outcomes for better and worse over time. I'm an emergency manager. I'm not a scholar. At the end of the day, I've spent most of my career in emergency operations centers. I may be one of the few people in a square mile who doesn't have a PhD. And I know that EOCs are desperate to be apolitical. They are desperate to be above the fray, right? To be neutral. Disasters are outside of social dynamics. We do not want to accept that the interventions that we promote can change social dynamics, can cause social unrest. During COVID, we did not want to see in our EOCs all of the mutual aid that flowered forth. The thousands of mutual aid groups that distributed food, that came together for housing, that developed financial assistance, usually without any connection to official response, through this burst of disaster solidarity. We didn't want to see it. And we didn't want to see how this shared pain that people felt, this glimpse at what the poet Dion Brand called the endoskeleton of the world, how that shared pain created an ability to see and join together across the boundaries of race and class. You know, of the marchers in the movement for Black Lives protests after the murder of George Floyd, those marchers were more impacted by COVID rather than less. More likely to have had a relative die, more likely to have seen terrible morbidity in that family. And they marched because these crises of structural racism and public health had come together, had joined. And that created an opportunity for us to see a new vision of the future, to glimpse a new world. What we call in the book an aspirational solidarity. But in the EOC, we did not deal with that fact, and we also didn't want to see the other side of it. The way that our interventions, our necessary, so important interventions, were interpreted by some as threats to their status. Journalists like Luke Mogelson have tracked a direct line between anti-masking protests, anti-vaccine protests, all the way through to the political violence of January the 6th, 2021. The same people, in many cases, radicalized, as they said, by the pandemic, coming together in a more diverse group of right-wing activists than we had seen before. They saw the future and they recoiled from it. They wanted the world to go back to the world they understood, the world that existed before. They wanted, in other words, to recover. In the EOC, we want to say that we are neutral, that we are apolitical, but our thumbs are on the scale. The response and recovery frameworks that we use are built around the idea of going back to the day before the disaster. However much you pretty them up with other language and other tools, that's their fundamental purpose. Kathleen Tierney and Joanne Nigg wrote about this in the 90s. They said, our disaster response helps to entrench the powerful. We do not respond in ways that beautifully surge the existing solidarity that's out there. We respond in ways that kill it. And punctuated entropy shows us that this could be a threat to our survival as a people, not least because disasters are one of the only times that real egalitarian change is possible. Walter Scheidel tracked human equality throughout history, and he came to the sobering conclusion that any time equality increased, it was on the back of intense suffering. Fatalities from violence, from climate crises, from pandemic mortality. In short, increasing human equality was bought on the backs of horror. There's another way to look at this. If you're a person who is working towards a more egalitarian society, you have to wrestle with the fact that that egalitarian society will come about in some way through crisis. And that means our charge is to figure out how to find that egalitarian society at as low a cost in human suffering as possible. Scheidel gives us a clue on this front. During the Great Depression, the New Deal, which was sold to Congress as a disaster relief bill, decreased inequality. Now, nobody's saying the Great Depression wasn't bad, but it wasn't Black Death bad. It didn't kill a third of the population. And Scheidel says that disasters like this, severe but not as severe, can produce greater societal equality if they are managed intentionally toward that goal. But our structures preclude us from moving in that direction. Our structures are built in many ways to prevent that from happening. So the choice to us is simple. How do we address the essential question of the next century of keeping our society together through disasters? How do we chart Quarantelli's winners and losers toward societal good? And the only way is to reboot our disaster response frameworks away from recovering the past and towards using them to develop a new aspirational future. This gives us a loophole in Scheidel's framework that helps us find an egalitarian society at a much lower cost of human suffering. It spares us the revolutions and the mass death that he and others otherwise think is likely. We have to manage disasters along a narrow pathway through all the fractals that disaster natality makes possible to achieve a phoenix effect for all survivors. Look, at the end of the day, for better or worse, probably worse, we're going to have dozens of times to test this theory over the next few decades as we enter the realm of the disaster swarm of the poly crisis. So I'm here today to urge you, to charge you as scholars and practitioners to help us understand how disasters shift the underlying social dynamics that we are dealing with, how to manage them in ways that we generate far more of Quarantelli's winners than losers. Because otherwise, the theory of punctuated entropy tells us that the next few decades are going to make the polarization we face after COVID look like a picnic, as disaster after disaster corrodes our society's ability to cohere into a functional community. Together, we must find ways to use the energy, the lightning of disaster natality toward finding an aspirational future for us all. Thank you.